Hello everyone and welcome to Application Development with ASP.NET. This is episode 19, part 14 of the Project Management System. Joining us, we've got our host, Mr. Nelson LeKay, also Zach Parrish, and myself, Jason Busby. Picking up where we left off last time, Nelson, let's continue.
Alright, so the goal in this video is to get a form that we can go ahead and use to create an admin user, and a login form that lets us communicate with the authentication server to log us into the system.
Okay.
So we're just picking up on the last video. If you remember, we have in our domain, we have our services for creating users. And this guy is who we're going to be using to create an admin user. And we have this user queries repository that has a method called doesAdminExist. And we're going to use this to make available a special route that's going to allow us to create an admin user if no other admin user exists in the system. And this is just a little shim that it exists temporarily before we get a proper installer going with our console application. But for now, and I guess the foreseeable future until we start really playing with the console application, this would work just fine because really creating an admin user is the biggest part of installation.
Mm-hmm.
Once you have an admin user, that admin user can do whatever he wants.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense.
So yeah, the first step is we need a route and we need a controller. So we need a user's controller, we need a corresponding route. And I know we kind of talked about routes previously.
Yeah, just a little bit. So take a moment and go back over them real quick. So what exactly is a route?
Yeah, I can do a quick cursory overview, but they are a pretty complicated or pretty involved subject that probably deserves its own video.
Sure, but I mean, we're talking about coding. Everything could be considered its own very specific subject that could have accompanying videos. So, I mean, just an overview.
Right. So we have this route table.routes object, and we can go ahead and invoke the map route extension method. And if you notice, I'm in the application start method, and this is the method that's called once every time a ASP.NET application starts, which is why it's called application start. And we have these routes, and basically a route is sort of a way for ASP.NET MVC to take in a URL, what you would see in the address bar of your browser, and turn that into a corresponding controller and action that is then going to spool up and invoke.
Okay.
So we have this map route method, and there's a few different little overloads we can use. We're going to go ahead and probably use this overload, where we can specify a name, we can specify a URL. That's actually not a very good name for this parameter. This isn't a URL. This is going to be a URL pattern, which is in its own special little language sort of thing that you have to know about. And then the defaults, which is an anonymous object that defines the default arguments that ASP.NET MVC is going to derive from the URL pattern. So for our first route, there are better ways to handle routes, but for the immediate future, we can go ahead and just define a catch-all route where we are going to call it default. And what I mean by catch-all is it's going to be controller action. And actually, we're not going to be using any defaults. I lied. And the reason we're not going to be using any defaults is because ASP.NET MVC can now completely identify what it needs to do when it hits a URL. So basically what happens here is that ASP.NET MVC will identify any two identifiers, any two strings of text and numbers separated by slashes, and it's going to match this route. And then it's going to stuff the identifier to the left of the slash into the controller variable, and the thing on the right of the slash into the action variable. And these are two special variables that are used by ASP.NET MVC to determine which things to invoke, which controllers to invoke, and which actions to invoke on those controllers. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and create a new users controller, and we still need to fix that at some point.
Oh, yeah, we sure do.
But yeah, I really want to do that on its own video because it's kind of a interesting topic. So we'll have our users controller, and our users controller is going to take in our users service, and we're not going to make our own user service class in here because that'd be dumb. Our user service, and it's also going to take in our user queries. And then it's going to have a single action for now called create admin. And first of all, it's going to say if user queries does admin exist, or if not user query does admin exist, then I'm just going to throw an exception here. Once we start up a proper route implementation, we will redirect to a URL like an error route or something. But for now, we're just going to throw a new exception to halt execution. And then we're going to go ahead and return a view. And then we'll have a corresponding create admin, users create admin, our own corresponding post method, and since this class doesn't exist yet, I'm just going to do that. Alright, so this class doesn't exist yet. This is the view model that we're going to be using. And I know that we kind of touched on those in the first video.
Mm-hmm.
Whoa.
Yeah, there's a little spelling there.
Alright, and the users create admin view model is going to be fairly interesting, actually. And the reason it's going to be interesting is we are going to essentially going to have this view model pass in all of the parameters of this create user method, which is fine for ID. User type, actually, we're not passing in. We're going to default to admin. Email address is going to be interesting. Password just going to be a string. And this actually, to get an email address through the view model into the controller is kind of a roundabout process. I'm going to go ahead and just code it out. Hopefully people will be able to identify a pattern. I'll talk as I type. But don't worry if you don't understand quite what the rules of the model binder are, because model binder has a lot of different rules, and being able to identify them, it kind of takes some time. So, I mean, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have the user's view model, and we're passing it into the post version. But you'll notice we haven't actually created any HTML for this, which might be confusing. So I'll go ahead and do that right now. I'll go ahead and go into my views folder. I'll go ahead and add a users folder into that. And then we don't have any HAML templates, of course. So I'm just going to come here, copy and paste. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to delete create user out of that and make sure index controller doesn't have any actions, which he doesn't. But he does require INC network provider for no reason. He should never do that. Controllers should never have that injected into them. So now we create user.haml. I'm going to delete all of this because we don't need it. And then I'm going to create the corresponding form. So the view model that's passed in this is going to dictate what model that this the generated C# class is going to implement. Excuse me. And so they are incredibly tightly bound to the point where the properties on this view model are going to correspond to what we go ahead and output here. So I'm going to actually implement both of these kind of in parallel. And then in addition to that, I'm going to pull up the user service. And I don't know, I'm going to throw him somewhere. I can't throw him there. I don't know why that is. But just to see what we're trying to actually pass into the service from the view model, from the view. So we need ID, type, email address, password. We don't need to worry about ID or type. So we need email address and password. So we go ahead and do a public email address. And a public string password. And then in our create user.haml, we're going to write the corresponding markup. Kind of ignore the scheme that I'm using to write this markup. We're going to be hooking into it later with CSS. So I'm going to start with a using HTML begin form. And then I'm going to do form row, and then I'm going to do HTML.editor for model address. I believe it is address. Let me check value. And then above him, I'm going to do a label for. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a password. All right, and so in the controller, at this point, this view that's going to be printed out, and we can actually see this view if we go ahead and build out. And that's what I'm going to do. We're going to get some errors from some code in the console application. These are just namespaces that no longer exist because we've since deleted them. So just go ahead and nuke them so we can build a solution out. Then in our user controller, we don't have any return for this particular method. I'm going to return null. I'm just going to cheat for now. And then I'm going to hit Control-Shift-B and Control-F5. Now, we should get a 404. That's good because our catch-all route doesn't actually supply any defaults, meaning our catch-all route has no idea what to do when there's no controller action specified. So we can go ahead and supply the controller and admin. Actually, hold on. It's not to create admin for the view. And I also noticed that we got some errors. It looked like we missed a virtual.
Oh,
just
no.
by the look of it. Yeah. It happens a lot, actually. Embarrassingly large amounts of time that I spend dealing with this issue. It's because methods also need to be virtual. And obviously static methods can't be virtual. So I'm going to go ahead and rebuild Control-Shift-B. I'm going to go back to Internet Explorer and refresh. And we want to create admin. And we get an error up on our request scope, line 56, so we can go ahead and debug that right now. Actually, I think I know why that's happening. Yeah, I know why that's happening. Hopefully. I'm going to go into our RequestScope.css file. We are hitting line 56. Field selector.node type. That's because the this is actually a bug that was in the session scope that we had since fixed, or maybe not. It's because we are not doing the field selector.body, and the reason is the actual node type of field selector, the expression we're passing in, is of type lambda, not of type member access. We need to say field selector.body.node type, which will be the body of that lambda, which will be a member access. And we need to do the same thing here. And go ahead and Control-Shift-B, refresh. And now we get a SQL error. It's impressive. I think that might be because are we on test or video demo 1?
I honestly don't
I think
remember.
we're on video demo 1.
We are on video demo 1, you're right. So video demo 1 users, let's look at him. He doesn't have a user type, or he does have a user type. Never mind. So we were saying that in user type equals user type.admin. That is impressive. Really wish that I could see the SQL that was being generated. So let's go ahead and knock out or bring up our profiler. Is that on your desktop?
Hang on one second, actually. Okay, Nelson, we're back. And for everyone that may be wondering, I had to quickly install the NHibernate Profiler because this machine has been reformatted recently. So now we're back up and going. All right, Nelson.
All right, so let's go ahead and run this through the profiler because this looks like something that should never happen. So the goal is to look for what code is actually being executed to make the syntax error appear. And you'll notice that when I refresh, nothing happens because we actually have to set up the project to work with the NHibernate Profiler. So to do that, we're going to go into our .web project, add a reference, and I'm going to go ahead and browse over to the wherever you installed the NHibernate Profiler to. It's going to include a bunch of assemblies here. You're going to want to go ahead and grab Hibernating Rhino's Profiler Appender version 4 and add it to the project. And finally, in the application.cs, we're going to go ahead and initialize the profiler to send out the information that it needs to work. And that's going to be in hibernating rhinos .profiler.appender.nhibernate.nhibernate-profiler.initialize.
All right.
Okay, so now that we've done that, I can go ahead and rebuild. And then I'm going to bring up the profiler and Internet Explorer at the same time. I'm going to refresh. And we get this. And this is cool. Actually, first I'm going to go ahead and fix this problem because the NHibernate Profiler apparently isn't smart enough to find our MySQL.data assembly, which means that we're going to have to copy it into the same directory as our binaries. And so this only applies if you're using MySQL and not MS SQL or SQLite. So we have this MySQL.data. We're going to want to make sure that his properties copy local is true. And then we're going to want to rebuild. And that will go ahead and copy the MySQL.data assembly into the binary folder. So that if I go here and right-click Clear All Sessions, come back here to Internet Explorer, refresh, we shouldn't get any more of those strange errors. Well, I mean, strange warnings. We still get the errors. And the errors are you have an error in your MySQL syntax. Above that, though, we have what's causing that. And anybody who knows SQL will look at this and say, what is going on right here? I mean, that's...
Yeah, where just equals 1? That's bizarre.
A pretty big failure on NHibernate's part. But it actually turns out it's a failure on our part. This is a bug that I later found but forgot to go ahead and fix up. And it's a really straightforward issue if you think about it, if you spend enough time thinking about it. But I'm just going to show you exactly where to go to fix it. In your .services mappings AutoMapper conventions class, remember this class is what tells the AutoMapper how it should map things and what it should map. We have this isComponent method, and this isComponent method is applied to every single property except for the ID properties and what are they called? Relationship properties. No, it's applied over relationship properties as well. It's pretty much applied over every property, including properties that should really not be components, which happen to be enumerations. And if you remember, our user type is an enumeration. So basically what it's going through is it's saying, and the AutoMapper is asking, is this enumeration object or property, which happens to be the user type property that we're having issues with, is he a component? And according to this criteria, he is. We shouldn't map him because he doesn't exist in the namespaces that we're directly mapping against. And the assembly that he's located in does start with honeycomb. So according to this code, he is a component. Unfortunately, mapping in an enumeration as a component is stupid and doesn't work. So essentially what we have to do is come in and say, make sure that he is not an enumeration.
Okay.
And that's what we have to do. So if I go ahead and build, we'll come back here, and we'll no longer get that error. And the error that we do get now, again, I think I mentioned this in the original HAML video, but these error messages are a bit of an eye strain, to be honest, because they're like an exception within an exception. So you really have to be able to scan these really quickly. And if you see right here, this is the actual error right here. The type honeycomb domain model value object's email address is defined in an assembly that is not referenced. You must add a reference to the assembly honeycomb.domain. And if you look at that, you might be confused because web app does have it should have a reference to honeycomb.domain, and it does. The issue is that those HAML files are being compiled into CS files and then compiled again by the C# compiler after the application is started in a completely different app domain. So we basically need a way to add a assembly reference to a project that we don't directly have access to. We can't. None of these projects here are projects that are being used to compile our HAML files. Fortunately, HAML makes that really straightforward for us because we can go into the web.config under our HAML section and add an assembly to honeycomb.domain. And if you're wondering if this is at all magical, it is not. Basically, honeycomb.domain, this will be passed into the equivalent of a /r compiler flag. And because the compiler is being executed in the same working directory as our web application's binary directory, the honeycomb.domain binary will exist because it's also being referenced by web app. If that makes sense.
Okay.
Okay. It's not magical. That's what I'm saying. So we go ahead and refresh, and we now have this. So really quickly, we have some issues here. And the first issue, if we go back to our markup, is I really haven't explained the label for and the editor for. That has to do with the model binder, sort of. That has more to do with data annotations. And that's something that really kind of deserves more or less its own sort of going over. But for now, you can kind of think of it as we are writing a lambda, an expression that's pointing to what we want this to be a label for. So it's pointing to this property on the model. And the editor for it is pointing to this property on the editor. Now the issue is how can we alter what the name is? Because if you look at these labels, they are essentially just defaulting to the name of whatever the last property that's being accessed is. So we have value here and we have password here. That's because the last dot is the value and the last dot is password. And to override that, we can do that by specifying a display for or a display name attribute on these properties. But here comes the issue. In our domain or in our view model, we are using a value type that's located inside the domain model. Now I could go into email address, I could come up here and I could say display name email address. But I'm not going to do that because that's introducing data annotations in which we're only using for the concept of views and view models. And that's introducing that to the domain. And I have a huge issue with that, especially when it comes to flexibility, because you might want to have another form that has a different display name, and it really constricts you once you start adding data annotations to your domain model. To get around that, what we're going to essentially do is replicate these value objects that we're going to be using inside of our web app and apply our data annotations there, and then apply implicit conversion operators back into the types that they need to be. So to do that, I'm going to go into our view models folder and add a new class called value objects. And I'm going to take this class and I'm going to write an email address and then required, and we'll see why that is there in a second. And I'll have a public string value to match directly with what we have in our domain value object, and then I'm going to write implicit conversion operators between this type and our domain value type. So we're going to just public static implicit operator email address, which I just imported from domain model value objects, and he's going to take in an email address required, and he's going to return a new email address. So we're just writing some implicit conversions really quickly. All right, sweet. So now that we have this email address required, we can go ahead and replace them here. But because we have an implicit conversion between email address and email address required, we can actually assign an email address to any type of email address required, and then this code will be executed, converting our types. So I personally think it's a pretty elegant way to get around the data annotation situation, because we are now able to mark up everything we want in this class of data annotations. So I'm going to go ahead and do a display name here. I'm going to do email address. And I'm going to build succeeded, come back here, refresh, and we will have our email address and our password, which is what we want so far. And we're lacking a submit button, which I can go ahead and bring in here as well. Okay. And now that we have a submit button, I can go ahead and outline some of the issues that there is with this particular code. If you ignore that error right there, actually, and take this and move it up here, and forget that it was anything different.
You didn't see anything.
No. So now we have this great admin. This will actually go ahead and do nothing. But I'm actually going to go back into our users controller. Instead of returning null, I'm just going to return a view of form, just for now. Just so that when we're posting to that, we get something, so I can outline a few issues. And the first issue is that we don't have any validation. So I can go ahead and create admin, and it's not throwing any errors. It's letting me execute this controller action without throwing any sort of error to the user. And so to fix that, I can go ahead and bring in some additional data annotations into our value object. And the particular data annotation is going to be required. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to password. I'm going to go back into our view model and say required. And then I'm going to Control-Shift-B, come back, refresh, or I'm just going to click on the address bar and hit enter so we don't repost the form, and create admin. And we still don't get any errors. The reason why we don't get any errors is because we never actually displayed them. So I'm going to go ahead and do html.validation some. Zach?
That's right.
Okay, sweet. I hate that word. Okay, now when we create admin, we now get errors. And if I fill in this, we get that error removed. If we fill in that, we get that error removed. Nice. And you'll also notice another issue, our password doesn't have a mask on it. And to fix that, we can simply go in here and add the data type data annotation.
You there, Nelson?
Yep.
Oh, there you go. For a second, things just kind of muted.
Yeah, we couldn't hear your keyboard. That's always scary.
All right, so now if we go ahead and refresh, we will now have a masked password. And finally, the last thing is I kind of want to bring in a regular expression that we can use to validate our email address.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to use the email address one, and I'm going to use this regular expression. And you can use any regular expression you find on the internet. If you do find this particular one that I grabbed off the main regular expression, I think it's regularexpression.net. It's like this big website dedicated to regular expressions. You will have to make a modification to it. You will have to add these capital or these lowercase a through z's.
Okay.
And the reason is for whatever reason his regular expression doesn't match capitals.
Gotcha.
Or for some reason it's case insensitive, or he assumes it's case insensitive when the regular expression engine in .NET isn't unless you tell it to, which unfortunately we have no way to tell it to. So, yeah. Okay. Make sure that the regex expression that you do pass in is what you want it to be, or pause the video and copy that, but I don't recommend that because that's very prone to errors.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so now if I go ahead and build again, our email address will only let us through if we pass in a valid email address. Still not a valid email address.
Got a comma in there. There you go.
There we go. And now it's a valid email address. Okay, so now that we have the form, I can go ahead and add the logic that's going to execute when the form is submitted properly. And to determine if a form doesn't have any errors, we're going to do the model state dot is valid. And that's a property we're going to again go into detail about. But suffice to say, if any of the model binder validation failed, is valid will be false. Otherwise, it'll be true. So now that we're in here, it means that no model or data annotation, or more appropriately, no model binding validation found any issue with our submission. So at this point, I can actually go into the user service and say user service create user. And I can pass in a new GUID. I can pass in the user type, which will be, I'm going to hit Alt-Enter, and that brought in something or other. Honeycomb, domain, model, value objects. We're going to create an admin. His email address is going to be form.address, and his password is going to be form.password. And then I'm going to return a redirect to action. And then, I don't know where I'm going to redirect it. I'm just going to redirect to index for now. Even though we don't have that action made, it'll just redirect us to a 404. But the point is that we're actually going ahead and invoking our user service. And so now if I come back here, refresh, create admin, we get a duplicate email found, which is nice, because I think we did not
Clear that out.
this data. Yeah, so let's go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to nuke that data somehow. Maybe. How do you nuke data in this thing? There you go. No. Is it this?
I'm not the guy who can tell you.
I've not played with this thing in a while now. There you go. No?
Oh, of course not. Because what? What is wrong with you? Are you kidding me? Okay, fine. Oh, you are. You know what?
Here you go.
New table. And Hibernate has no problem recreating that. The only thing I have to do is trigger an application restart. And to do that, I'm going to go into my web.config, add a space, hit save, and then come back into here and refresh. I'm not going to resubmit the form. I'm just going to come out here, the address bar, and hit enter. And then we get that. Because our admin does exist now, for some reason. Did he magically get created? No. Oh. I don't know. I'm probably as much as to blame. We want to do the opposite of that, actually. If the admin does exist, we want to throw. Otherwise, we don't.
Right.
Boolean logic is very difficult sometimes. Okay, and then we get redirected to the 404, just like I said we would. And if we come back here, we'll now have a user here, our admin.
Cool.
With his email address and his password.
Nice.
So yeah, then I can go ahead and create a login and log out really quickly, because now we can do that.
Okay.
If I come into controllers, I can go ahead and create not a web control, account controller.
There goes that muting thing again.
Mm-hmm.
All right, logout is actually really simple, so I'm going to do him first. Logout is authentication.logout. That's it. And then we redirect him somewhere. I'm actually going to redirect him to the login method. Okay, so that's straightforward. Login is going to be a little bit more involved, because we're going to have to create another view model. No. there we go, for our account login. And he's actually going to pretty much share this exact same thing. It's going to be the same concept. So I'm just going to copy him, paste him over here, bring in our using statements, and then we can go ahead and use this view model. We're going to return a view with this view model. Then we're going to create the corresponding post method. If the model stays valid, then essentially all we have to do is go ahead and try authentication.login, no, not log out, login, form.email address, form.password, and then if that works, go ahead and return redirect to action, index, catch the authentication exception if it happens. And if it does, do a model state.add model error. And actually, this is something that irritates me about try catch blocks, but you can't do single line catches. I just can't stand that. You have to add the curly braces. I don't know why. I know it's kind of off topic, but it's all you should know. And then we're going to go ahead and say password ex.message. And then if this fails, we're just going to go ahead and say return form, or return view form. Sweet. So does this code more or less make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you see now how the service layer kind of interacts with the controllers?
Mm-hmm.
It really, well, in my opinion, like the entire goal, like I said, is for each individual service method call to essentially just be a line. Mm-hmm. So these try blocks are just going to be line after line of service calls, and then they're going to have the corresponding catches that add the proper errors.
Right.
So now we can go ahead and write the view. The view is actually going to be very similar to create admin because it has virtually the same view model. And it's not going to be named create admin. It's going to be named login. And his submit button is going to be login. And so if I hit Control-Shift-B, we get a build succeeded. Now if we go into account login, we should get a login form. Instead, we get an error for one reason or the other. It's mostly probably because our account controller, that's how you spell controller, right? Account. What is an account? Okay, Control-Shift-B. Come over here, refresh. Now we get our login form. So if I go ahead and just hit login, we get our required stuff. If I just go ahead and pass in things, we get specify valid email address. If I specify an email address that I know isn't in the system, we will get invalid email address or password. And where did that message come from? If you look, that's coming from our domain services authentication service. Invalid email address or password. So without writing much code, we've essentially interfaced with, I already went over what that is. And if we just do test.test.test, we get invalid email address or password. But if we specify the password of test and I hit enter, we still get invalid email address or password. Let me make sure that that's the right username. Test.test.test. Come back here, test.test.test. Password is test. Or so I thought it was. I'm going to go ahead and recreate that user really quickly by nuking the table again, making sure I type in the right password. Otherwise, I think we might have a bug in our authentication. But that should be pretty straightforward to track down.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and trigger another application restart. And the reason I'm doing that is so NHibernate will pick up, reinitialize, and then re-migrate the tables for us. And I'm going to go to users, create admin. And so NHibernate is creating that table for us behind the scenes. It should now be blank. So I'll do test.test.test. Password is test. Create admin. All right, now we got redirected to index, which obviously doesn't exist yet, but that's the behavior we wanted. And if we go to account login, yeah, there we go. I just mistyped the password.
Gotcha.
And so now we're authenticated. Finally, I want to do two more things really quickly. First of all, I want to go into our index controller, and I want to rename him. Yeah, I want to rename him dashboard controller really quickly, because dashboard is going to be kind of the index of this entire system. And I'm going to give him an index method, and all he's going to do is return view. And then I'm going to create a dashboard folder, which magically appeared. Actually, I think ReSharper went ahead and renamed that folder. Or something, unless I'm blind and didn't see it before. So then we're going to create an index, and I'm going to do... Okay, so now we have a dashboard to actually go to. And at that point, I'm going to go into users. I'm going to change this to dashboard index. And I'm going to change account controller to go to... Or it's going to be index dashboard. Sorry, the thingy is the other way around.
Of course.
There you go. Now it's the right way around. And then finally, I'm also going to add one more thing to our users controller. I'm going to say authentication service, which we don't have a reference to. Oh, thank you, media player. I don't know what keyboard combination I typed to make that come up, but it really wanted to come up. All right, so I'm going to bring in the authentication service. I'm going to do auth.login as, and I'm going to log in as the newly created admin. But of course, to get his ID, I'm going to have to take this expression and turn it into a variable. And then I can go ahead and do user ID. And then now I'm logging in as the user when I redirect it to index dashboard. And the reason is I'm going to go ahead and really quickly, just to confuse everybody, add in a new filter. And we're going to be talking about filters in depth. But I figured we might as well just show a valid use case for filters now. And then when we talk about them, there'll be more context.
Okay.
Alrighty. So basically just a real quick overview of what a filter is it's something that we can go ahead and conditionally apply to specific controllers and actions. So I'm going to make a filters namespace in our Honeycomb web project. I'm going to call this the authentication filter attribute. And he's going to inherit from log. I don't know if that makes sense. He's going to inherit from filter attribute, or action filter attribute. No, filter attribute, that's the one. And he's going to override, he's going to action filter attribute. There we go. And he's going to go ahead and override on action executing. And then we're going to apply some attribute usages to him, because he is only going to be valid. Oh yeah, if you ever wonder what you can stick attributes on, Jason, that is it. So essentially everything, including return values, which is incredibly bizarre. But anyway, class or method. There we go. And then his on action executing is going to go ahead, he's going to find the authentication service, and then he's going to ask him if he's logged in. And if he's not, we're going to redirect to the login method on our account. So to do that, we have to go ahead and get our authentication service. And we do that by asking the dependency resolver. And if you remember, we replaced the dependency resolver with our own autofact stuff. So essentially by doing this, we are basically treating AutoFact as if it were a service locator. Now we can say if not auth is logged in, then go ahead and say filter context.result equals new redirect result. And we can do that, or we can do redirect to route result. And I'm going to go ahead and make a route called login. And then I'm going to pass in a just an empty route value dictionary just to satisfy the signature. And then otherwise, we're just going to let it pass through. And then, so if you notice, we haven't created the login route yet. I'm going to go ahead and do that in our application.cs. I'm going to come down here and say route table, routes, map route, login, and then pass in the defaults of controller equals account, action equals login, and I'm going to bring him above the other one so that he has more precedence. Because if I had him down, well, actually, in this particular instance, it doesn't matter because we'll get into that later. I'm just going to put him above because it feels better to me.
Okay, fair enough.
There is a reason why, and we'll get to that. So we now have our authentication filter attribute, which we can then go apply to whatever classes and methods we want. I want to apply it to log out, but I don't want to apply it to log in. Actually, I don't know why I called him authentication filter. Sorry about that. I'm actually going to call him requires login attribute for now. So requires login attribute sounds good. Requires login, and I just hit Alt Insert to bring in our Honeycomb Web filters. And I'm going to go ahead and apply him to that. I'm going to apply him to our, most importantly, to the entirety of our dashboard controller. So every single action that's invoked against dashboard is going to go through our filter first. And so now I can go ahead and test it. So Control-Shift-B, we now come into here. We're at, if we go to dashboard index, we should get kicked back to account login. Sweet. And if you notice, the URL changed to /login because we overrode that route, and we'll see that later. And now if I just log in as test and hit enter, we should now be allowed to go to dashboard index. Should now be allowed. Am I just blind or something? Didn't we already go through this?
Yeah, but I thought you verified it this time around.
Unless I had caps lock on. Nope. Oh, that's kind of bizarre, really. Our authentication service. I'm going to go ahead and here, and then I'm going to hit F5 to go into debugging.
Okay, you got a bit quieter. Don't know if the mic got further away from you or if you just got quiet on purpose.
I don't know.
Okay.
So now we're in here. We want to go to login. Wait for a while. Go to test. And we should break here, which we do. Hopefully we should get a user. Oh, it just froze on me. Is that TeamViewer that froze, or is that you that froze?
Huh. No, it's looking like Visual Studio. Wait, no, there it goes. It just took a minute.
Thinking.
There we go. Okay, so a user is clearly not null. So his validate password, if we step into him, and our get password hash, password salt, that's all right. I mean, really, this should be... I don't think that's the same thing. No, I think that is the same thing, actually. The encoding, something is messing up with the encoding. That's the issue right here.
Right.
MySQL is deciding to encode our values differently, though it's confusing why that would work. It would let us log in that one time, but not this time.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to go ahead and say that for the next video. But however, I am going to go ahead and nuke the database again.
Okay.
Create the new admin just to prove that our authentication filter is still working. And I wasn't counting on the encoding issue. Just for those of you who don't know, I primarily work in MS SQL, not MySQL, so I'm not familiar with all the nuances. I mean, MS SQL has plenty of nuances. I'm just familiar with those and not MySQL's. Okay, so I went into web.config, added that space. I'm going to go to users, create admin. And I'm going to create test. And we get to dashboard index. And if I refresh, it's letting me through. If I come back here and trigger an application restart, we will lose our session. And therefore, we should become logged out. So if I come back here after restarting the application, hit F5, we do get kicked out.
Mm-hmm.
And just to verify this just one more time. Yeah, I don't know. It looks like an encoding issue. That we'll fix later.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. So is that where we're going to call it for now then?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, awesome. You what, Nelson?
Yeah, I think it's a good time.
Okay. All right, well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and wrap that up, wrap all this up for this video, and in the next, we'll take a look at getting the encoding issue corrected and move forward. So thanks a lot.